I want to start with a confession. For most of my life, I was very, very good at disappearing. Not literally, I mean I was physically present. I showed up to school. I sat at the dinner table. I laughed at the right moments. I answered when people called my name. But the real me, the version that felt things too deeply, noticed things too intensely, wanted things I couldn't even name yet, that version had learned very early to vanish. To make himself small. To look away. I grew up in a mid-sized city, the kind of place where everyone knows your family, where your grandfather's reputation still opens doors, where people say things like act right without explaining what right actually means. My father was a quiet, hard-working man who communicated mostly through the sports teams he cheered for and the newspaper he read every morning. My mother was warm but perpetually exhausted, the kind of tired that lives in the eyes before it ever reaches the voice. They were good people, they loved me. I want to say that clearly because what comes next isn't a story about bad parents or a broken home, it's something more complicated than that. It's a story about silence and how silence, even when it comes from love, can become a cage. I was 11 years old the first time I realized I was different. I was at a birthday party, my classmate Tariq's birthday. There were streamers and a cake with too much frosting and some older boys from the neighborhood hanging around the edges of the yard. One of them, I think his name was Daniel, was maybe 15 or 16, and he was playing music from his phone, bobbing his head, completely unbothered by everything and everyone around him. I remember standing at the edge of the yard watching him. Not in the way I watched other people, there was something different in it, something that pulled at a place behind my ribs I didn't have a name for. He glanced over and caught me staring, and I looked away so fast I nearly stumbled over my own feet. I felt my face go hot. I felt my heart do something strange. And then, and this is the part that I think shaped the next decade of my life, I felt afraid. Not of him, he was just a random teenager at a birthday party. I was afraid of what I just felt, afraid of that pull, afraid of what it might mean. And so I did what I would do for the next 10 years of my life. I looked away. I got very good at looking away. Middle school was a performance. High school was a longer, more exhausting performance. I became a master of deflection, the friend who was always busy, always joking, always steering conversations away from anything too personal. I dated a girl named Sana for 8 months in 11th grade because she asked me first and because I didn't know how to explain why I kept hesitating. She was lovely, kind, deserved better. When we broke up, mutually, gently, she said, "I always felt like you were somewhere else." She wasn't wrong. I was somewhere else? I was in a locked room inside my own chest, sitting very still in the dark, telling myself that if I just stayed quiet enough long enough, the thing I was hiding from would eventually get bored and leave. It didn't leave. It never leaves. That's the thing nobody tells you about the truth. It doesn't get tired, it just waits. By the time I was 19 and started university, I had developed what I thought of as a very sophisticated system of survival. I was outgoing enough that people didn't worry about me. I was private enough that nobody really knew me. I had friends, real friends, people I genuinely cared about, but even with them there was this glass wall. I could see through it. They could see through it, but nobody ever tried to break it. Until him. His name was Adam. I want to pause here for a moment because I know you came for a love story and this is where it begins, but I need you to understand who I was when I met him. I need you to understand the full weight of what it meant for someone like me, at that particular point in my life, to be seen. Because being seen when you've spent your whole life hiding isn't romantic. It's terrifying. It was the second semester of my first year at university. I was studying literature, a decision my father had made peace with after I promised I would also do a minor in something practical. I spent most of my time in the university library, which sounds very studious but was actually mostly about the fact that the library had a back corner on the 4th floor with a window seat where I could sit for hours without anyone bothering me. That corner was my sanctuary. It was mine. Until one Tuesday in February when I came up to the 4th floor and found someone already sitting in my window seat. He was tall. I noticed that even though he was sitting down, folded into the window alcove with the kind of easy comfort that suggested his body was used to fitting into spaces. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, the kind of hair that suggested it had a personality of its own. He was wearing a gray sweater with a small tear near the collar and reading a book that was too far away for me to see the title. I stood there for probably 3 full seconds before he looked up. Brown eyes, the kind that seemed lit from somewhere behind them. "Oh," he said, "is this your spot?" Not in a challenging way, not sarcastic. He said it the way you'd say it if you genuinely wandered into someone's living room by accident and wanted to make it right. No, I said, it's fine. I turned around and found a different seat at a table nearby. But I kept glancing at him. Not in the way I'd spent a decade carefully training myself not to, just noticing the way his foot was tucked underneath him, the way he occasionally mouthed words while he read, barely moving his lips, the way he'd tap his pen against his knee in this irregular rhythm that was somehow not annoying. After about 40 minutes, he got up and left. As he passed my table, he paused and said, "It's a good spot. The light changes around 4 o'clock, you should be there for it." And then he was gone. I sat very still for a moment. Then I moved to the window seat. He was right. Around 4, the light came through the glass at an angle that turned everything gold, and the city outside looked different, softer, like a version of itself it only allowed when it thought no one was paying attention. I don't know why that felt important, it just did. I saw him again 3 days later. He was in the library cafe on the ground floor, standing at the counter with his phone out, clearly trying to show the barista a photo of something and laughing about it. The barista, a middle-aged woman named Hamida who'd never smiled at me once in 6 months of daily coffee purchases, was laughing too. He had that quality, the kind of energy that made spaces warmer. I got my coffee and left quickly. Or I tried to. "Hey, window seat guy." I turned around. He was waving me over with the kind of casual confidence that I had always associated with people who'd never had a reason to be careful. I walked over. "I'm Adam," he said, extending his hand. "Zane," I said, shaking it. "Zane," he said my name like he was testing how it sounded, seeing if it fit. "What are you studying?" "Literature." "Oh, interesting," he tilted his head. "What kind?" "What do you mean, what kind?" "Like, do you want to write, teach, just read for the rest of your life?" I blinked. Most people, when I said literature, either nodded politely or made a joke about being unemployable. Nobody had ever immediately asked what I wanted to do with it. "I haven't decided," I said. He smiled, not the polished, social smile people use to fill silence, but something more genuine, like I'd said something that genuinely interested him. "Fair, I'm architecture, second year, I have no idea what I want either. I'm just trying to figure out what kind of spaces make people feel human." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. "That's a specific way to think about it," I said. "It's the only way that makes sense to me," he shrugged. "Why design a building if you don't know what it's going to do to the person standing inside it?" I think about that conversation a lot even now, because what he just described, thinking about what a space does to the person inside it, was exactly what I had never had language for when it came to my own life. I'd been standing inside a space I'd built for myself, a small, dark, carefully constructed space, and I'd never once stopped to ask what it was doing to me. We talked for 20 minutes. I was late to my seminar. I didn't care. Over the next 4 weeks, we ran into each other the way you run into people when you're subconsciously trying to run into them but won't admit it. The library, the cafe, once on a Tuesday evening. At a small bookshop off campus where I'd gone to find an out-of-print collection of Urdu poetry that my professor had mentioned. He was there looking at architecture theory books and seemed genuinely delighted to see me in a way that was either completely natural or the most effective performance of delight I'd ever witnessed. I still couldn't tell which. That's the thing about Adam that I found most destabilizing in those early weeks. With most people, I could read the performance. I could see the seams. Years of careful, defensive observation had made me fluent in the difference between what people were showing and what they were actually feeling. With Adam, I couldn't find the seams. He was just present, fully, uncomplicatedly present in a way that felt almost radical. When he asked you a question, he actually waited for the answer. Not the polite waiting where someone's already forming their reply before you finish talking, but real waiting, like your words mattered and he didn't want to miss any of them. When he was bored, he looked bored. When he was excited about something, his entire body showed it. He'd lean forward, talk faster, use his hands. When I said something he disagreed with, he'd say so, not aggressively, just cleanly, like disagreement was a thing two people did together rather than something to be avoided. I was not used to this. I found it deeply unsettling. I found it deeply wonderful. There was an evening in March. I remember it was raining. one of those heavy, sudden rains that arrive without warning in early spring when I was stuck on campus later than usual. I'd been in the library working on a paper, and suddenly it was 9 o'clock, and outside the windows, the rain was hitting the glass like it meant something. I was gathering my things, calculating whether I could make it to the bus stop without being completely soaked, when my phone buzzed. "Are you still on campus? I'm in the architecture building, second floor studio. Come find me if you want to avoid dying in the rain. Adam." I stared at the message. He'd gotten my number 2 weeks earlier when we'd agreed to meet at the bookshop, and I'd been running late. I'd texted him once since then about a book recommendation. He'd texted back with 4 recommendations and a voice note of himself laughing because one of the recommendations was, he admitted, a book he'd never actually finished. I stood in the library with my bag on my shoulder, rain streaking the windows, and had what I can only describe as a small, private argument with myself. Half of me said, "Go, it's just avoiding the rain, it's practical, it doesn't mean anything." The other half of me knew very clearly that it meant something. I just didn't know what yet, and not knowing what something means when you've spent your life being afraid of what things mean is its own particular kind of vertigo. I went. The architecture building at 9 o'clock on a rainy Wednesday was almost completely empty. The second-floor studio was a large open room with high ceilings and long tables covered in models, small buildings made of white cardboard and balsa wood, some elegant and finished, others half-constructed and bristling with pins and marks. Adam was at a table near the far window, bent over something, a desk lamp casting a warm circle of light around him. He looked up when I came in and grinned like I'd done something genuinely impressive just by walking through the door. "You came," he said. "I came," I said. He was working on a model, a residential space, he explained, for a final project. A house designed around the idea of what he called emotional thresholds, the idea that every good home has spaces you move through that prepare you for what comes next. An entryway that slows you down, a kitchen that orients you, a room that asks nothing of you. "That last one," I said, "what does that look like?" He pointed to a small corner of the model, a recessed area with low walls and what looked like an inward-facing window. "Just a place that doesn't perform," he said. "Most rooms want something from you, even living rooms want you to sit and arrange yourself in a certain way. This room just receives you." I stood looking at the model for a long moment. "I've been trying to build one of those my whole life," I said. I don't know why I said it. I hadn't planned to. It just came out, the kind of truth that slips through when your guard is down and the rain is loud against the windows and someone's just said something that touches the exact shape of the thing you've been carrying. Adam looked at me. Not the quick, polite glance of someone who's heard something personal and doesn't know what to do with it. He actually looked at me with this steady, unhurried attention that felt like being a book someone was genuinely reading, not skimming. "I know," he said quietly. 2 words. But they landed like something much larger. "I know." Not, "What do you mean?" Not, "That's interesting." Not the anxious pivot to a different subject. Just the calm, clear acknowledgement of someone who had already seen something in me and was simply confirming that it had been seen. My throat tightened. I looked away. Old habit. And that was the first time he didn't let me. Not physically, he didn't touch me, didn't reach out, but when I looked away, he said gently, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" I said, though I already knew. "Look away." He said it without judgment, just observation, the same quality of attention he gave to buildings and light and rain. Right when things get real, you look somewhere else. The room was very quiet for a moment, just rain and the hum of the buildings heating and the tiny world of that architectural model sitting between us. "It's a habit," I finally said. "Most walls are," he said. "I want to be honest with you about something. When I say that Adam saw me and that this changed things, I don't want you to imagine some clean, cinematic moment where the walls come down and everything immediately gets easier. Because that's not what happened. What actually happened was much messier, much slower, and much more painful than any movie version of this story would be willing to show you. Because being seen when you've been hiding for a decade doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like danger. After that night in the studio, I went home and barely slept. Not because I was daydreaming or floating or any of the warm things people associate with falling for someone. I was scared. Not of him, I want to be clear about that. Scared of myself, scared of what it would mean to stop looking away. scared of the conversation I would eventually have to have with myself first and then maybe with the people I loved, if I followed this feeling to wherever it was going. I'd spent so long building that small, safe, dark room inside myself, and now someone had found the door and was standing outside it, not banging or demanding, just there, just waiting, and I didn't know what would happen to me if I opened it. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I pulled back. For 2 weeks, I avoided Adam. Not dramatically, I didn't block his number or cross the street when I saw him coming, but I canceled the coffee we'd tentatively planned. I gave one-word replies to his messages. I stopped going to the fourth-floor window seat. He noticed. Of course he noticed. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the night in the studio, I was sitting in the library cafe, a different table than usual, smaller, tucked against a wall, and he sat down across from me without asking. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said, not looking up from my book. "You've been weird," he said, still no accusation in his voice, just the same clear, level observation. "I've been busy." "You're always busy," he folded his hands on the table. "I'm not trying to pressure you, I just want to know if I said something wrong." I put down my book. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in 2 weeks, and the thing I noticed was this: he looked genuinely worried. Not offended, not angry, worried about me. That hit differently than I was prepared for. "You didn't say anything wrong," I said. "Then what happened?" I opened my mouth. Then I closed it. He waited. "I'm not very good at," I stopped, started again. "There are things about me that I haven't," stopped again. "Zane," his voice was very gentle, "you don't have to tell me anything. We can sit here and talk about literally anything else in the world. I just want you to know that whatever it is you're carrying, I'm not going anywhere." I blinked rapidly. Felt something hot behind my eyes that I absolutely was not going to let turn into actual tears in a university cafe. "You don't even know me that well," I said, which came out sounding more hostile than I meant it to. "I know you well enough," he said. "You remember the light changing at 4 o'clock even when nobody's watching. You read or do poetry for fun and then pretend it's for class when someone asks. You always position yourself so you can see the whole room, and when something scares you, you get really still and quiet and pretend nothing's happening." He paused. "Am I wrong?" I stared at him. "No," I admitted. "Then I know you well enough," he said. "I want to tell you that I immediately poured my heart out, that the conversation cracked everything open and we talked for hours and I walked out lighter. But that's not what happened. What happened was that I nodded, picked up my book again and said, "Okay." He stayed for another 20 minutes and we talked about his project and my paper and something mildly ridiculous that had happened in his studio class. When he left, he touched my shoulder briefly, just a moment, warm and light, and said, "See you around, Zane." And I sat there in the cafe after he'd gone, completely still, with the feeling of that hand on my shoulder fading, and realized that I was crying. Quietly, just tears tracking down my face, which I wiped quickly before anyone noticed. Not sad tears. Something else? The kind of tears that come when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and someone offers, for the first time, to help you set it down, and you realize how heavy it's been only when you feel the weight of the offer. There's a moment, and I think anyone who has gone through something like this will recognize it, where you can't pretend anymore, not because someone forced you to stop, not because anything dramatic happened, just because the pretending suddenly costs more than the telling. For me, that moment came on a Saturday night in late April. There was a gathering at a flat off campus, one of those low-key social events that aren't quite parties but have enough people that you can drift in and out without being noticed. I'd gone because my friend Nadia had essentially dragged me, and because staying in my room was starting to feel less like solitude and more like hiding, which is different. Adam was there. I hadn't known he would be. He was standing near the kitchen talking to a group of people I vaguely recognized, and when he saw me come in, his face did this thing, this immediate, warm opening, and he waved like he was genuinely glad to see me. I waved back. For the first hour, we moved in the same space without directly talking. I was aware of him the whole time, which corner of the room he was in, which conversation he'd moved to when he laughed, and at what. I was doing the thing I'd gotten good at, cataloging without approaching, being near without being close. But then I ended up on the small balcony off the living room, getting some air, and he came out a few minutes later. I had a feeling you'd be out here, he said. Predictable, I said. Consistent, he corrected, smiling. He leaned on the railing beside me, not close enough to make anything of it, just near. Below us, the street was lit in orange from the lamps, and somewhere down the block someone was playing music softly, and the air still had that early spring bite to it that reminded you winter hadn't fully decided to leave. We stood in silence for a bit, comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't ask you to fill it. Then he said quietly, "Can I ask you something, and you can absolutely tell me to mind my own business." "Go ahead. Are you happy?" Of all the things he could have asked, of all the directions a conversation could go. "Are you happy?" I laughed, a short, involuntary sound that was mostly honest bewilderment. "That's a big question for a Saturday night," I said. I know, he didn't take it back, didn't soften it, just waited. I looked out at the street. "No," I said. One syllable, the truest thing I'd said out loud in years. He didn't react with pity or with the anxious energy people bring to uncomfortable admissions. He just absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, with that steady, unhurried presence. "What would make you happy?" he asked. I started. "Not in general," he said, "right now in this specific moment." I turned and looked at him. And something happened that I didn't plan, couldn't have predicted, and am not sure I could have stopped even if I'd tried. I just looked at him fully, without looking away, without the reflexive deflection I'd spent 10 years perfecting. I looked at him the way I'd wanted to look at things my whole life and never let myself, completely, openly, without armor. And he looked back. Not shocked, not uncomfortable, just there, receiving it. The way that corner of his architectural model was designed to, just receiving you without asking anything of you. The music from down the block drifted up. "This," I said finally, "this specific moment would make me happy." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, more like confirmation. Like he'd held a hypothesis quietly for some time and I'd just given him the data he'd been waiting for. "Okay," he said softly. "Just okay." Not loaded, not a declaration, not a question, just the calm, clear acceptance of what I'd said. And standing on that balcony at midnight with the orange street lamps and the distant music, I felt the glass wall I'd carried around inside my chest for the better part of a decade develop a crack that I knew, deep in my bones, was never going to heal. I didn't want it to. 2 weeks later I told him. We were in the library, the 4th floor, the window seat, late afternoon. The 4 o'clock light was doing its thing, turning everything gold. He'd been talking about something to do with his project and I'd been half listening and half watching the light, and suddenly the words were just there. "I'm gay," I said. He stopped mid-sentence. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. "Okay," he said. "I've never said that out loud to anyone before," I said. "I know." "How do you know?" He looked at me with that lit from behind gaze. "Because you said it like it cost you something." I nodded. I didn't cry this time, I'd expected to. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as geographical, like a landscape had shifted. Like I'd been living in a place that had a different name than I thought, and now I finally had the right map. "Does it change anything," I asked, "between us?" He thought about this for a moment, genuinely thought, didn't reach for a quick, reassuring answer. "It explains some things," he said, "but no, it doesn't change anything." "What does it explain?" "Why you look away," he said it gently. "You've been carrying that word for a long time, carrying something that heavy makes it hard to stand still." I looked at the city outside the window, the golden light. "I don't know what comes next," I said. "Nobody ever does," he said, "you just start." "I want to talk about what happened after, because the after matters as much as the moment. Because this isn't a story where saying the word out loud fixed everything. It didn't. If anything, the weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, because once you say a truth, it starts having consequences. It starts asking things of you. It asks you to be consistent. It asks you to be brave. It asks you eventually, inevitably, to say it not just to the one person who makes you feel safe, but to the people who might not. My mother found out on a Sunday afternoon 3 months later. I'd been building up to it for weeks, losing sleep, rehearsing, retreating, rehearsing again. In the end, it happened not in the carefully planned conversation I'd prepared, but in a moment I didn't expect. She'd asked me casually over tea if there was anyone I liked at university. She meant it lightly, the way mothers ask when they're hopping. The answer is simply yes. I said yes. She waited. I told her his name. The silence that followed was the longest of my life, longer than the one in the library with Adam, longer than any silence I'd ever sat in. I watched my mother's face go through something complicated and private, not anger, not horror, but something I can only describe as grief mixed with love, which is perhaps the most human combination of feelings there is. She said, "I need some time." She got up and went to the kitchen. I sat at the table for a long time. She came back 20 minutes later with a fresh cup of tea and set it in front of me and sat back down and said, "I love you. I don't fully understand this yet, but I love you." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the tearful embrace of television movies. There were hard conversations ahead, weeks of adjustment, questions I had to answer patiently, moments where the ground felt uncertain beneath both of us. But she said, "I love you before anything else." That matters. That matters more than I can explain. My father was harder. He is still a work in progress, and I say that without bitterness because I understand now that some people need more time and that needing more time is different from not loving you. He knows. He has chosen a careful, quiet acceptance that doesn't have words yet, but that shows up in small, stubborn ways, the way he still asks about my studies, still texts me about football, still says drive safe when I leave. Love sometimes arrives in the most indirect routes. I'm learning to follow them. Now, here's the part where I have to be completely honest with you, because this is a true story and true stories are not always neat. Adam and I fell in love. Gradually, the way you fall into a river when you've been walking along the bank for a while, not all at once, but in small, inevitable increments until suddenly you're in it and can't remember exactly when the water started. We were together for a year and 8 months. And then we weren't. Not because of anything dramatic. No betrayal, no explosion, no sudden revelation. We simply grew in directions that stopped overlapping cleanly. He took a semester abroad for his thesis project. I got deeply consumed by a writing fellowship I hadn't expected to get. Distance did what distance does when two people who love each other aren't quite ready to fight for the same future. When it ended, I grieved. God, I grieved. The kind of grief that sits in the chest and makes food taste like nothing for a while. The kind that makes you wake up at 3 in the morning and reach for your phone and then remember you're not supposed to. But here is what I knew, even in the deepest part of that grief, with a certainty that nothing has dislodged since. He didn't break me. He built me. He built me in the way that good architecture builds you, by designing a space in which you could finally feel human. By creating the conditions in which the person I actually was, rather than the person I'd performed for a decade, could finally stand upright and take up room. He showed me that being seen doesn't destroy you. It's the hiding that does. I'm 23 now. I live in a small flat with too many books and a window that gets the afternoon light at an angle that makes everything golden around 4 o'clock. I have a group of friends who know me, really know me, the kind of knowing that doesn't require a glass wall. I write. That's what I decided to do with literature. I write stories about people who are carrying things they haven't said out loud yet, because I know what that weight feels like and I know what it feels like to finally set it down. I still get scared sometimes. Old fears don't vanish, they just become less loud, like a television in another room you've gotten good at not watching. But I don't look away anymore, not the way I used to. When something scares me now, I try to do the thing that terrified me most of my life. I try to stay in the feeling, stay in the room, stay in my own skin rather than retreating to that small, safe, dark corner where nothing could touch me but nothing could reach me either. It's not always comfortable. But it's mine. The real thing, the actual thing, the version of a life that doesn't require disappearing to survive. If you've made it this far, I think there's something you needed in this story. Maybe you're carrying something that doesn't have a name yet, the way I was for years. Maybe you're standing in a room you built to keep yourself safe, and the walls have started to feel less like protection and more like prison. Maybe there's a word in you that you've never said out loud in any language to any person. I want to say this to you as clearly as I can. The word won't destroy you. The hiding might. I know that's easy to say and harder to live. I know that not everyone has an Adam, not everyone has a person who shows up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right kind of patience. I know that some families are harder than mine was. I know that some cities, some countries, some households are less safe. And I don't want to minimize any of that. But I want you to know that somewhere in the geometry of your life there is a window seat with afternoon light. There is a person who will wait while you find your words. There is a version of you that doesn't need to disappear to survive. You don't have to know who you are yet. You don't have to have the language yet. You just have to stop looking away. Just stop, look back at whatever it is, at whoever it is, at yourself in the mirror in the quiet without the performance. Look back. Stay. That's where it starts. Epilogue. The last time I saw Adam. About 8 months after we ended, I ran into Adam at the bookshop. The same one where we'd both been looking for different books and found each other instead. He was older looking, not aged, just settled, the way people look when they've stopped trying to seem like something and started just being it. He'd graduated. He was working at an architecture firm doing residential projects, still thinking about spaces that make people feel human. We got coffee, we talked for an hour. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't loaded with the weight of what we'd been to each other. It was just warm, the way it had always been. The particular warmth of someone who knew you before you knew yourself and saw you the whole time anyway. At the end, standing outside the cafe with the afternoon cold on our faces, he looked at me and said, "You seem different." Different how? He considered this. "You used to always look like you were ready to run," he said. "You don't anymore." I smiled. "I finally figured out where I am," I said. He nodded like this was the answer he'd been hopping for, maybe for years. "Good," he said, "you were always somewhere good." We hugged. He walked one way, I walked another. And I didn't look back. Not because it hurt, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need to. I was already where I needed to be. This story is dedicated to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of their own truth and been afraid to step into it. You are not alone. You were never alone. And whoever you are, whatever room you've built, whatever word you're carrying, whatever face you've been afraid to show, I want you to know that there are people in this world who will look at you and say, "I know," and mean it, and stay. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Take your time, but please don't take forever.